In the autumn of 1983, 16-year-old Colette Louise Aram was living in Keyworth, Nottinghamshire, England. She was a trainee hairdresser, known in the community as a polite and responsible teenager. On the evening of 30 October 1983, Colette left her home on Normanton Lane to walk to her boyfriend's house. The route was familiar, and she usually made the journey without incident. Witnesses reported seeing her walking along Nicker Hill, and she was last seen there around 8:10 p.m. Later that night, residents in the area reported hearing a woman screaming, followed by the sound of a car speeding away. This was the last indication that Colette was in danger that evening. When Colette did not arrive at her boyfriend's house and failed to contact her family, her parents, Eric and Gloria Aram, became concerned. They contacted the Nottinghamshire police around 10:30 p.m. to report her missing. A search of the area began immediately. Local residents, friends, and volunteers joined officers in combing the nearby streets, footpaths, and fields. The search continued into the early hours, with police using vehicles and foot patrols to cover a wider radius. The local community was actively engaged in looking for Colette, distributing leaflets and making inquiries of anyone who may have seen her. On the morning of 31 October 1983, Colette's body was discovered in a field off Thurley Lane, approximately a mile and a half from where she had been last seen. She had been abducted, raped, and strangled. Forensic pathologists concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation and that she had suffered sexual assault prior to her murder. The police classified the case as a homicide and immediately began an investigation, treating every detail of the scene as potentially significant. Officers recorded and photographed the crime scene, collecting trace evidence and ensuring the chain of custody for all materials. Investigators examined the field, surrounding footpaths, and nearby roads for any indication of vehicles or other activity related to the abduction. Items such as clothing, soil, and biological materials were collected and stored for potential forensic analysis. Police also investigated local properties for potential witnesses or people who may have seen a suspicious person or vehicle. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and classmates to determine Colette's last known movements. They compiled lists of people who were in the area, including potential passersby, as well as individuals known to Colette through school or social connections. In June 1984, less than a year after Colette's murder, the case was featured on the first ever episode of BBC's Crime Watch. The program reconstructed the events of her disappearance and appealed to the public for information. Viewers were shown the route Colette had taken and the area where her body was found. The broadcast generated more than 400 calls to Nottinghamshire police. Investigators carefully followed up every lead, cross-checking witness statements and examining potential suspects. Despite the volume of information, no one was conclusively identified as a suspect, and the case remained unsolved. During the 1980s, the investigation included interviews with thousands of individuals. Detectives explored possible vehicle movements and reviewed vehicle registration records. Officers also monitored locations where Colette's abductor could have temporarily held her or where items from the crime might have been discarded. Investigators considered the possibility that the perpetrator had left evidence behind, including items with fingerprints, hair, or biological material. All preserved materials were cataloged carefully for potential future testing. Over the next 2 decades, forensic science created new opportunities. In the late 1980s and 1990s, DNA profiling began to develop, though initial testing on the preserved evidence from the Aram case was limited by the technology of the time. Investigators retained key items, including a blood-stained paper towel found in a nearby pub and pieces of Colette's clothing. These items became crucial to the eventual solution of the case. In 2004, Crime Watch revisited the Colette Aram case for its 20th anniversary. The episode renewed public attention and prompted new witness calls. Police continued to review archived case files and conducted further interviews. While no new suspects were identified, the renewed scrutiny highlighted the importance of maintaining preserved evidence and the potential for new forensic technology to resolve cold cases. By the mid-2005s, forensic laboratories had developed improved methods for extracting and analyzing DNA, even from degraded or small samples. Police submitted preserved items from the 1983 investigation for re-examination using modern DNA techniques. A full DNA profile of the killer was generated, but initial comparison against databases did not produce an immediate match. Investigators continued to monitor new entries into national DNA databases, knowing that the profile could eventually identify the perpetrator. In June 2008, investigators received a crucial breakthrough through familial DNA analysis. A young man, Paul Hutchinson, unrelated to the murder but in the national DNA system for a minor offense, provided a profile that produced a familial link to the DNA recovered from Colette's case. Police used this connection to identify his father, Paul Hutchinson, as a suspect. Hutchinson had lived in Nottinghamshire and was known locally. He had no significant criminal record at the time of the murder and had appeared to lead a normal life in the years following Colette's death.
Paul Hutchinson was arrested in April 2009 and charged with the murder of Colette Aram. Investigators presented evidence showing that he had been in the area where Colette disappeared and that forensic evidence connected him directly to the crime scene. DNA collected from Hutchinson matched the profile generated from the paper towel and other preserved evidence. Witness statements and travel records further corroborated his presence in the area on the night of the murder. During preliminary hearings, Hutchinson initially entered a plea of not guilty. He later changed his plea, admitting that he had killed Colette Aram in 1983. On January 25, 2010, Nottingham Crown Court sentenced Paul Hutchinson to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The court heard that Hutchinson had abducted Colette while she was walking to her boyfriend's house, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her. He left her body in a field and later visited a pub in the area, leaving behind a paper towel that eventually became key evidence in solving the case. Investigators stated that Hutchinson had no prior convictions for serious offenses before Colette's murder, and that he had successfully avoided detection for more than 26 years. The identification and conviction were made possible only through the preservation of forensic evidence and advances in DNA profiling technology, including the use of familial DNA techniques. The case demonstrated the value of maintaining evidence from cold cases and the ability of modern science to solve crimes decades after they occur. Following Hutchinson's conviction, Nottinghamshire police emphasized that the case provided closure for Colette Aram's family. Her parents and siblings expressed relief that the long investigation had resulted in the identification and conviction of her murderer. The case also served as a model for other cold case investigations, showing how combining historical police work with modern DNA analysis could bring answers even after decades. Colette Aram's case remains significant as it was the first featured on Crime Watch, and it became one of the earliest examples of a cold case being solved through DNA evidence. The investigation involved collaboration between law enforcement, forensic scientists, and the public. The resolution of the case highlighted the importance of perseverance in police work and the impact of evolving scientific methods in criminal investigations. The murder of Colette Aram, though committed in 1983, was ultimately solved in 2010, 26 years later. Her killer, Paul Hutchinson, was brought to justice, and the case is formally recorded as solved. The investigation continues to be studied in police training and forensic courses as an example of successful cold case resolution, illustrating the intersection of meticulous evidence preservation, modern forensic science, and investigative persistence.
In October 1985, 28-year-old Denise Marie Stafford was living in Sarasota, Florida, with her family. On October 12, 1985, Denise went to bed at her home on the 300 block of Tarpon Avenue, where she lived with her husband, Frank Stafford, and their young child. Frank was working an overnight shift at a local bar that night. He left the residence in the late evening, planning to return the next morning. Denise remained alone in the home during the early hours. On the morning of October 13, 1985, neighbors and friends became concerned when Denise did not answer the phone and Frank did not return home. Around 9 a.m., a family member checked the residence and found Denise unresponsive inside the home. Emergency medical personnel were called, and Denise was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives from the Sarasota Police Department were called to investigate what was immediately treated as a homicide. Investigators entered the residence and began documenting the condition of the home. They observed no clear signs of forced entry, which led detectives to consider that Denise may have known her attacker and might have allowed that person inside. Law enforcement officers photographed evidence, collected trace materials, and noted the position of items in the home. The scene was processed methodically, with officers wearing protective gear to avoid contamination of physical evidence. Detectives also interviewed neighbors and family members to establish a timeline of Denise's last known activities. At the time of her death, forensic technology was limited. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and many modern methods were unavailable to investigators in 1985. Initial forensic testing focused on fingerprint analysis, blood type comparison, and examination of trace evidence. Biological materials recovered from the scene were preserved for potential future analysis, but no usable identity information could be extracted with the methods available at the time. Investigators interviewed a wide range of potential witnesses. They spoke with Denise's neighbors, local residents, and patrons and employees of the Playground Lounge, a bar where Frank Stafford had worked and where Denise and Frank were known to socialize. Officers also examined the comings and goings of individuals in the neighborhood and compiled lists of people who had interacted with the Staffords in the days and weeks prior to Denise's death. Witness interviews identified a man named Joseph Magaletti Jr. as someone of interest. Magaletti had worked as a bouncer or security staff member at local bars, including the Playground Lounge during the 1980s. Multiple people connected him to the area and to social circles that intersected with the Staffords. However, while Magaletti was known to law enforcement, investigators in 1985 did not find sufficient evidence to arrest or charge him in connection with Denise's homicide at that time. Despite repeated interviews, canvasses, and follow-ups on leads, the case grew cold. Detectives maintained detailed case files, preserving evidence and witness statements, but no arrests were made and no suspect was formally charged. Over the next decade, periodic reviews of the case were conducted, but forensic limitations and lack of advances in DNA technology meant that breakthroughs did not occur. The Sarasota Police Department continued to classify Denise's death as an unsolved homicide. During the late 1980s and 1990s, the field of forensic science advanced. DNA profiling became more sensitive and widely used in criminal investigations. Older cold cases began to be revisited as new tools became available. However, in Denise's case, attempts to extract usable DNA from preserved evidence using 1990s and early 2000s technology produced only partial results that could not conclusively identify a perpetrator. The Sarasota Police Department's cold case unit maintained custody of evidence from the Stafford homicide, periodically reviewing it and submitting what materials they could for analysis as laboratory methods improved. In the 2010s, DNA testing techniques advanced significantly, allowing forensic laboratories to derive profiles from smaller and more degraded biological samples. Investigators examined Denise's clothing, specifically the pants she was wearing at the time of her death, as a possible source of trace biological material. These items had been preserved since 1985 and were submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, and other specialized laboratories for advanced analysis. In March 2020, Sarasota police announced that forensic scientists had succeeded in generating a DNA profile from the preserved evidence using modern extraction and amplification methods. The profile was entered into state and national DNA databases, including the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. Within months, the profile produced a match to Joseph Magaletti Jr. Magaletti's DNA profile had been included in criminal databases after a later conviction for an unrelated murder. Magaletti had been convicted in 1995 of the murder of 62-year-old Sarasota registered nurse Kathleen Leonard, whom he had killed during a burglary. At the time of that conviction, DNA technology had advanced, and his profile had been entered into CODIS as required by law. Magaletti was serving a life sentence when the match from the Denise Stafford cold case was returned. Investigators noted that Magaletti had been acquainted with the Sarasota area in the 1980s, and his work at local bars put him in proximity to the Staffords. Based on the DNA match, law enforcement concluded that Magaletti had been at or near the Stafford home in October 1985, and that his biological material was present on Denise's clothing. Sarasota Police Chief Eric Anderson stated at a press conference that the DNA evidence was the reason the case could finally be resolved after more than 35 years. Although Magaletti was already incarcerated for another murder, Sarasota police obtained a formal link tying him to Denise's homicide. Because he was alive at the time of the DNA match, investigators notified prosecutors and coordinated with the state attorney's office to determine whether additional charges could be brought. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and filed a charge of first-degree murder against Joseph Magaletti Jr. in connection with Denise's death. Magaletti was informed of the new charge and made appearances in Sarasota County Court. His defense counsel filed motions challenging aspects of the DNA evidence, seeking to question the integrity of the preserved materials and the interpretation of the forensic results. The prosecution's case hinged on the scientific conclusion that Magaletti's DNA was present on Stafford's clothing and that he had the motive and opportunity to commit the homicide. In 2021, Magaletti entered a plea agreement in the Sarasota County Court. He pled guilty to second-degree murder in connection with Denise Marie Stafford's homicide. Under the terms of the plea, he was sentenced to life in prison, to run concurrently with his existing sentence for the 1995 murder of Kathleen Leonard. Because of his age and previous incarceration, he would remain in custody for the remainder of his life. The resolution of the Denise Marie Stafford cold case ended a 35-year period in which she had no identified perpetrator. Sarasota police emphasized that the key to solving the case was the preservation of evidence and the application of modern DNA technology that allowed minute biological material to be analyzed when such techniques did not exist at the time of the homicide. Stafford's family, including her mother, Dorla Knipper, publicly acknowledged that learning the identity of the person responsible brought a degree of long-awaited closure. In statements issued through law enforcement, family members expressed gratitude to investigators who kept the case active and pursued new forensic avenues over many years. The Stafford case has since been cited in law enforcement circles as an example of the value of long-term preservation of evidence, the evolution of forensic technologies, and the increased capability to solve cold homicides long after they occur. Agencies throughout Florida and across the United States have highlighted this case when encouraging other departments to periodically re-examine cold files with new tools. Because Magaletti was already convicted of another homicide and serving a life sentence, his guilty plea in the Stafford case did not result in additional incarceration beyond what he was already serving. However, the formal identification and conviction provided an official resolution in the eyes of the law and in the record of Denise Marie Stafford's death. The case remains documented in Sarasota criminal justice archives, including forensic reports, court records, and police files. Denise's death is recorded as a solved homicide with a named and convicted perpetrator. Today, Denise Marie Stafford's case is often referenced in discussions about cold case investigations, the application of forensic DNA evidence, and interagency cooperation. Her homicide, unsolved for decades, was closed through a combination of preserved evidence and advances in science, providing a factual resolution to a case that for many years lacked answers.